biggest problem with being too nice is that almost no one sees it as a problem. Not your friends, not the people whose comfort you have organized your entire life around managing, and, most importantly, not you. Because your mask looks like virtue. Your wound looks like character. The thing that is slowly making you invisible to yourself looks, from the outside, like precisely the kind of man the world keeps saying it needs. That is why this particular pain is so difficult to locate, and why it runs so deep for so long without being named. You are not suffering because you are too good. You are suffering because you learned, earlier than you can probably remember, that you were not permitted to exist without being useful. There is a specific kind of man this describes. He shows up, he listens, genuinely, not in the performative way where a person is simply waiting for their turn. He remembers what matters to the people in his life and acts on it without being asked. He absorbs tension in rooms rather than generating it. He is the person others call reliable, easy to be with, someone who makes things less difficult than they would otherwise be. These descriptions have been offered so consistently and received with such evident gratitude that at some point, too far back to locate precisely, they stopped being observations other people made about him and became the architecture through which he understood himself. And somewhere inside that architecture, something has been grinding for a very long time. Not with the obvious friction of a man in open conflict, with the quiet, internal attrition of a self that has been systematically set aside. Not all at once, not through any single moment of betrayal, but in the accumulated weight of thousands of small moments where the real answer was swallowed and the managed answer was offered in its place. You know this moment. Someone asks something of you that you do not want to give. Your body registers it first. There is a half-second of honest refusal, clear and unambiguous, living in your chest before your mind engages. And then the training deploys. The accommodation arrives smoothly, sometimes even warmly. The other person moves forward satisfied, and in the space they leave behind, something in you registers an absence. Not resentment exactly, something quieter and more troubling than resentment. The recognition that what just happened was, once again, a performance, and that the real version of you, the one that formed a response before the editing began, was somewhere behind it, watching through glass, waiting for a moment of genuine contact that did not arrive. This is not a character flaw. Carl Jung would not call it weakness. He would call it the cost of a very specific psychological structure, one that was built for reasons that once made complete sense, and that has been running the show ever since. The mask and the man wearing it. Jung gave the name persona to the social identity every functional adult constructs in order to move through the world. The word is borrowed from the Latin term for the mask worn by actors in ancient theater, and the borrowing is deliberate. The persona is the version of yourself that has been calibrated through years of social feedback to be acceptable, comprehensible, and non-threatening within the particular human environment you inhabit. Building a persona is not pathology. Every psychologically healthy person develops one. The problem is not the mask. The problem is what happens when you forget you are wearing it. For most men, the construction of the persona began before they had the psychological vocabulary to observe it happening. You learned, at an age too early to defend against the lesson, what version of yourself was safe and what version was costly. Perhaps the expression of anger produced consequences disproportionate to its intensity. Perhaps visible need made the adults in your environment uncomfortable or unavailable. Perhaps the qualities that came most naturally to you, assertiveness, direct desire, the clean refusal, produced reactions that threatened the relationships you depended on for your sense of safety. And so, with the extraordinary adaptive intelligence that children deploy in the service of survival. You learn to manage them. You learn to route them underground. You learn to lead, consistently and fluently, with the version of yourself that kept the room intact. And here is the essential trap. It worked. It worked consistently enough, for long enough, that the management strategy eventually stopped feeling like strategy and started feeling like character. The suppression became so fluent, it became invisible, even to you. Jung called this identification with the persona, the moment when the distance between the mask and the face collapses so completely that the man can no longer distinguish between what he genuinely wants and what his trained self automatically produces. When he reaches for his own opinion and finds a reflex instead. When he tries to locate what he actually desires and discovers that the question feels almost foreign, as if wanting were a language he once knew and has slowly forgotten how to speak. Think about a specific kind of moment. You are in a conversation and someone says something you fundamentally disagree with, not on a trivial matter, but on something that actually touches your sense of what is true. Notice what happens in your body in the half second before you respond. There is an answer that forms, honest, direct, unambiguous. And then, almost simultaneously, the editorial process begins. The response is examined for threat. Will this cause conflict? Will this make me seem difficult? Will this cost something I'm not prepared to pay? And by the time words leave your mouth, they have been processed into something considerably more palatable than what was originally there. A gentle suggestion of your actual position, wrapped in enough qualification that it cannot be experienced as confrontational. You call this diplomacy. You call it emotional maturity. Sometimes it genuinely is. But sometimes, and the difference matters more than almost anything else in this conversation, it is the automatic self-erasure of a man who has learned at a level far below conscious choice that his authentic response is a liability. Jung would call that the persona doing exactly what it was trained to do. The question is whether you are still the one choosing when it runs, or whether it runs you. What lives in the dark? The shadow is one of the most misunderstood concepts in all of depth psychology, and the misunderstanding matters enough to correct before anything else can land. Most people assume the shadow is the repository of a person's worst qualities, their cruelty, their selfishness, their capacity for harm. Those things can certainly live there. But Jung was precise about what the shadow actually contains, and his precision changes everything. The shadow holds everything that has been disowned, not only what is destructive, but what is merely inconvenient. Not only what would harm others, but what would simply require others to contend with you as a real, so complex, sometimes difficult presence rather than as a consistently agreeable surface. For the man who has spent years inside the too nice persona, what has accumulated in the shadow is not primarily darkness in the conventional sense. What lives there is, in large part, the ordinary materials of a functional self, the capacity to want something and say so without immediately softening it into irrelevance, the ability to feel genuine anger, not chronic, weaponized anger, but the clean, informational anger that arrives when something has violated a real limit, and to let it exist for a moment without converting it instantly into patience. The desire to take up space in a room is the natural expression of someone who has a right to be there. The will to refuse something cleanly, without the paragraph of apology that always follows. These are not dangerous qualities. In an integrated man, they would simply be called presence. They became shadow material not because they are destructive, but because in the specific psychological formation that produced the too nice persona, they were experienced, at a critical developmental moment before the nervous system could hold a more nuanced interpretation, as threats to belonging. Being needed is not the same as being known. And here is where the hydraulics of the psyche become impossible to ignore. What is pressed underground does not stay still. It accumulates. It develops pressure. Because it has been denied the modulating influence of conscious awareness, never examined, never integrated, never metabolized into actual character. When it finally does express itself, it arrives distorted. This is a critical nuance Jung would insist upon. The shadow does not contain only pure, suppressed potential. It contains potential that has grown in the dark, without guidance, without contact with actual values. Which means that when it erupts, it does not arrive as the clean, measured expression of a healthy self finally given permission to speak. It arrives outsized, disproportionate, bewildering to the man experiencing it and to everyone around him. This is why the too nice man's anger, when it finally breaks through, seems so strange. It is not the immediate anger of a man whose limit has just been crossed. It is the pressurized release of something sealed and accumulating for years, finding a gap. This is why the passive aggression, the inexplicable withdrawals of warmth, the silent punishments that seem to come from nowhere. These are not character inconsistencies. They are the shadow speaking in the only language available to it when integration has been refused for long enough. The language of eruption rather than expression. Jung would say this is exactly the moment when the shadow begins to pressure the conscious self, not to destroy it, but to force a confrontation that should have happened long ago. Nietzsche had a name for what the suppressed inner life becomes when it has no path to genuine outward expression. He called it ressentiment, the specific psychological state of the person whose will has been consistently denied its natural direction and has consequently turned inward, curdling into a system of moral accounting. The man who cannot move his energy outward becomes the man who keeps score, who experiences his patience as an investment and his sacrifice as a currency, who waits, with a patience so profound it barely announces itself as waiting, for the world to repay what he has given. The calculation runs quietly. I have been good, I have been generous, I have made myself easy to be with, easy to keep, easy to love. The return on that investment is coming, and when it does not come, when the partner loses attraction despite all the accommodation, when the promotion goes to someone less considerate, when the friendship reveals itself as thinner than the investment warranted, the injury is not proportional to what was externally lost. It is proportional to the entire accumulated weight of everything that was suppressed in order to deserve it. You were not too good. You were too invisible. And you built the invisibility yourself, one managed response at a time. The cost hidden in plain sight. Viktor Frankl observed that the deepest existential suffering he encountered across decades of clinical work was not primarily produced by trauma or catastrophe. It was produced by the quiet, structural experience of living a life that was not quite one's own, a life in which a man was pursuing what he had been told to want, performing what he had been told to feel, and discovering, in the honest interior silence that occasionally breaks through even the most carefully maintained performance, that none of it was his. The too nice man lives inside this vacuum in a very specific way. His life appears from the outside, generous and full. He is present in his relationships. He contributes. He is valued. But if you were to ask him, in a moment of sufficient silence and safety, what he actually wants for himself, from his own life, without reference to what others need from him, the pause that follows would be more revealing than any answer he eventually produced. He knows, with extraordinary precision, what the people in his life need from him. He is often surprisingly opaque to what he needs from them. Think about the man who is impeccably available to his partner, who asks how she is doing with genuine attention, who adjusts and accommodates and anticipates, who has structured significant portions of his emotional life around making sure she is comfortable, seen, supported, and who cannot understand why the intimacy keeps thinning, why the attraction keeps receding despite his consistent investment. He gave everything. He was present, but he confused care with presence. Genuine presence requires a self to be present with. The continuous management of another person's experience, however loving its intent, is not intimacy. It is a sophisticated form of disappearance. Over time, even the most patient partner feels, with a vague and slightly guilty unease, that they do not entirely know the man they are with. Because they don't. They know the persona. The self beneath it has been made so consistently unavailable that even long-term closeness cannot locate it. The professional version runs with its own texture. The man who is universally liked, trusted, considered a cultural asset to every team he joins, and who is, with a regularity that should eventually become diagnostic, passed over for leadership. He is esteemed everywhere and decisive nowhere. Valued as support, overlooked as a force, and he processes this not as information about his own suppressed assertiveness, but as confirmation of a fundamental injustice in how the world rewards virtue, which keeps him, with elegant precision, from ever having to examine what is actually producing the outcome. If you never disappoint anyone, you can never be real to anyone. The architecture of reclamation. The work of integration does not begin with motivation, because motivation in the conventional sense has been organized around the wrong foundation. Deciding to be more assertive, to set better limits, to simply stop accommodating, while the underlying architecture remains unchanged, does not work. The renovation fails not because of lack of effort, but because of misdiagnosis of what needs to change. What needs to change is not behavior. It is the relationship between you and your own interior. The first movement of this work is learning to locate your actual response before the editing begins. Every time a situation calls for accommodation, every time someone makes a request, every time the social pressure to agree or defer or soften activates, there is a fraction of a second in which your authentic response exists before the trained response replaces it. That first flicker is not noise. It is signal. It is the only direct contact you have with what you actually want, as distinct from what you have been organized to want. Stop deleting it so quickly that it never even registers. You do not need to act on it immediately or without discernment. You need to notice it exists. That practice, sustained over time, rebuilds a faculty that has been systematically underused, the capacity to know in real time what you genuinely think and want and refuse, before the social calculation has a chance to override the raw data. There is a somatic difference between genuine generosity and compulsive accommodation, and learning to feel that difference is among the most practically transformative things a psychologically serious man can do. Genuine generosity is light, open, chosen. There is no compression underneath it, no subtle breathlessness, no faint resentment braided into the giving. Compulsive accommodation, occupying the identical behavioral territory, feels entirely different from the inside. It is slightly compressed. There is a quality of holding something in check, something adjacent to anger, something that makes the giving feel, even in the moment of performing it, like a cost rather than an expression. When you say yes and there is lightness, that is character. When you say yes and there is compression, that is the wound speaking. The distinction, practiced with sufficient honesty, begins to rebuild genuine agency in every domain it touches. Stop responding immediately when asked for something you do not want to give. Let the silence exist for a moment without rushing to fill it with accommodation. That small pause, that half second of honest contact with your own interior before the persona deploys, is not rudeness. It is the beginning of a different relationship with yourself. The second movement is re-establishing contact with the exiled parts of the shadow, not to perform them, but to recognize them as real and as yours. There are things in you that you have been managing away for a long time. Anger that you converted into patience so many times that you can no longer locate the moment of conversion. Desire that you edited into preference, then into suggestion, then into quiet irrelevance because the full force of it felt like too much to place in a room. Opinions genuinely held, privately felt with some intensity, that you consistently softened because being experienced as difficult was too costly to risk. A need to be chosen, not just needed. A hunger to be known, not just useful. You do not need to broadcast these things. Integration is not performance. It means creating enough private, honest interior space for the full range of your inner life to exist without immediate editorial management. Writing, in a context with no audience whatsoever, is one of the most reliable paths into this territory. Not writing for insight or toward any conclusion. Writing until you encounter something on the page that you have been, without fully realizing it, afraid to look at directly. What is in the shadow is not only pure suppressed potential, it is potential that has grown without guidance, which is precisely why it needs to be brought into contact with your conscious values rather than simply released. The recognition that something is real and that it is yours, and that integrating it into conscious character is your responsibility. That is the beginning of genuine psychological work. Jung described this process as individuation. And what he meant, stripped of its theoretical weight, is the relocation of the center of psychological gravity from the social field to the interior self. The development of internal authority, the capacity to know what you value, what you refuse, what you want, and what you are, without needing any particular person or social structure to confirm it in order for it to feel real. This is not isolation. A man with genuine internal authority can be profoundly warm, deeply connected, extraordinarily generous, because his connection to others is no longer the primary source from which his sense of self draws its stability. He is present with people rather than dependent on them, and that shift transforms the character of every relationship it touches. The third movement is the practice of the clean refusal, not as aggression, not as a corrective statement about how things are going to be different from now on, as a simple, unelaborated act of self-possession. The capacity to say no to a request, to an expectation, to a social dynamic that requires you to be smaller than you are, without the automatic paragraph of justification and apology that the trained persona deploys to make the refusal safe for everyone else's comfort. A no that stands on its own. That does not require the other person to feel good about receiving it in order for it to be valid. This will feel wrong at first. It will register internally as aggression, as unkindness, as a betrayal of the identity you have spent years building. That discomfort is not a signal that you are doing something harmful. It is a signal that you are doing something unfamiliar, that a muscle unused for long enough will resist its first use. The resistance is not evidence of error. It is evidence of growth in a direction that growth has not previously been permitted to move. Practice once this week. Say one clean no, without excessive justification, without the performance of a man explaining his transformation. Just the honest, quiet act of a man choosing, for once, to tell the truth about what is actually there. The fourth movement is the most fundamental, and it underlies everything else. Start asking yourself with real honesty what you stopped doing the moment you began performing the version of yourself that your current life requires. not what you think you should want to return to. What you actually find yourself quietly drawn toward when no one is evaluating you. Those small, persistent gravitational pulls are carrying information that is more reliable than almost anything your constructed self has concluded about who you are supposed to be. Follow them. Not dramatically, not with declarations, but with the quiet, sustained act of letting what is genuinely yours begin to take up a little more space in the life you are actually living. That is where the libido, Jung's term for the total animating energy of the psyche, begins to move again. Not in the grand gesture or the dramatic reinvention, in the small, honest act of following what actually interests you, even when it makes no immediate social sense. This is where individuation begins, not when you improve, when you differentiate. What is waiting beyond the performance? If you have recognized yourself in any of this, if what has been described here has carried the specific and slightly uncomfortable sensation of something accurately named, then I want to close by saying something that carries no performance and no borrowed comfort. The niceness you have been living inside is not false. The care, the attention, the genuine consideration you have brought to the people in your life, these are real. They are expressions of something actual in your character. The wound was never that you were too good. The wound was that goodness became the only door through which you were permitted to enter a room. That it was required rather than chosen. That the version of you capable of disappointing people, of wanting things without apology, of occupying space without managing everyone's reaction to your presence, that version was never given the same permission to exist. That permission does not need to be granted by anyone else. Jung understood that the journey toward wholeness, what he called individuation, is not the journey toward becoming a better version of your current self. It is the journey toward becoming a more complete one. A self that contains the full range of what you actually are. The warmth and the refusal, the generosity and the self-possession, the desire to connect and the capacity to disappoint. Not as competing qualities requiring careful management. As the integrated expression of a man who has stopped needing to hide half of himself in order to be accepted by the other half of the world. You are not too good for this world. You are too hidden in it. Kindness without a self is not virtue. It is submission wearing virtue's clothing. But kindness with a center, kindness that knows what it refuses, that exists alongside genuine desire and honest limits and the unmanaged truth of what you actually want, that is not weakness softened, that is character. That is the thing you have been circling for years without being able to name it. You do not need to become hard. You do not need to become cold or calculated or strategically indifferent to the people who matter to you. You need to become whole. Because the man who is too nice does not need a different personality. He needs the one he already has. All of it. Not just the half he decided was safe to show. Stop performing goodness. Start choosing it. That is the difference. And it is everything.